Hey everyone, this is Darkstar and welcome back to another video here on TryHackMe. Today we're going to go ahead and do the room vulnversity. So first, go ahead and join this room, then we're going to go ahead and get our box deployed. So first and foremost, go ahead and click into task 1 and click the deploy button to get your box started. Now this box is pretty quick about coming up. It takes about 2 to 3 minutes to come up. But after that, you can go ahead and scan it. So now that we've completed task 1, which is just deploy the machine, and then we've also connected, which you can see that I've connected in this TMUX tab there, let's go ahead and move on to reconnaissance with task 2. So with task 2, we're going to be performing reconnaissance with the tool called Nmap. Now, while this room does provide a little bit of detail on Nmap, I highly recommend going through and doing the room RP Nmap, as it's a much more in-depth tutorial on how to use this tool, which is one of the core tools that you will use within penetration testing and even network management. So I'm going to glaze over a little bit of this just because this is pretty self-explanatory with what it's teaching you. We're going to actually go ahead and perform this scan though. So we're going to use Nmap. It actually instructs you to use TAC lowercase S uppercase V, which is a service version enumeration. I'm actually going to go ahead and do a little bit more than that with Nmap TAC uppercase A, so it's an aggressive scan that includes a SYN scan, a service version scan, which is what was requested here, and then it's going to perform the operating system guessing, so TAC capital O with this scan. And then I'm going to use dash lowercase s uppercase C. That is going to run common scripts, so common enumeration scripts. If it finds, for example, a service that is running, it's going to interrogate it to find some additional information with that service. For example, if it's SMB, it's going to go through and figure out if there's anything open with that. And then dash p dash, this is set to enumerate all ports, so it's not just going to do the typical top 1000. This is going to go through everything. And then the IP itself here. And I actually killed that run right away because I did forget to save it as output. This is something you always want to do because you never know when you're going to need to come back to the output of your Nmap scan. So continuing on, we can see the actual results. So I've gone ahead and run this just because this does take a little bit of time. It's going to take, I want to say, about 10 minutes or so, depending on the speed of your connection. So let's take a look at the output. First, we can see that there's FTP running on port 21, VSFTP. Now, this is not the actual version that has the issue. There is a version of VSFTP that has a backdoor because its code was... it had some nastiness injected into it for one version, but they fixed that pretty quickly. This is meant to be a rabbit hole here, to be a bit of a distraction versus some other things running on this box. Then we can see SSH that's running along with the version here, which if we scroll down, we'll take a look at that in just a moment. We can see the version that's running, so OpenSSH, very, very common to see on what we're going to see here is a Linux machine. We're going to see that NetBIOS, so Samba is running. This is your actual Samba port, and then the NetBIOS port that's running there. That's for compatibility reasons. Looks like we have a Squid proxy as well that's running on port 3128, and then we have a web server that's running on 3333. So that appears to be something that was hidden intentionally. This is not your default port, of course, for a web server, as that's going to run on port 80 or preferably port 443 if it has HTTPS enabled. So this is something that's worth checking out. And it looks like we've already got our HTTP title of Vuln University, which that's pretty interesting for a CTF box. So we'll take a look at that in just a moment. First, let's return to task 2. Scan the box. How many ports are open? So we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 ports are open. What is the version of the Squid proxy running on the machine? Now, this is something that running this with the TAC lowercase s capital V is going to get you. And we can see that the Squid proxy is running 3.5.12. How many ports will Nmap scan if the flag -p-400 was used? It's going to do 400. That's pretty self-explanatory. Using the Nmap flag -n, what will Nmap not resolve? This is DNS. And there's a bit of a hint in the question with resolve, because whenever you're looking for a DNS name, you're resolving it. In this specific case, why would we do that? DNS is useful more so in a domain environment, or maybe something that is connected to the public internet where we know it might have a DNS name. In this specific case, because we're looking at an isolated box that doesn't have a DNS server running on it, we don't really care about resolving DNS, and putting this flag in there will actually save us a little bit of time on our scan. Now, do you typically need to do this? No, but this is a convenience factor, and if you know that you don't need it and you want to be a little bit stealthier, you can put that on there. However, this is very useful if we, it's rather useful if we want to resolve DNS on a domain environment where we know that there's a DNS server. What is the most likely operating system this machine is running? So this one we can determine in a couple different ways. Because we've gone ahead and performed the aggressive scan in my case, we can see that it's going to do operating system enumeration for us. However, we can get it from a number of different places, and this is something that I actually mentioned in the RP Nmap video as well. So we can see here in SSH, it's going to tell us the version of the package that is installed, and it says Ubuntu over and over again, because different versions of software installations have different indicators that lead to knowing that, oh, this is an operating system, or this is the operating system that this package is installed upon, rather. So we can see that Ubuntu's all over the place. Even without having going through and getting to the enumeration part, we can see that there are plenty of places where Ubuntu is popping up. But if we go down, we can see that, yeah, it says Ubuntu all over the place. So here, let's go ahead. What port is the web server running on? We can see that's running on port 3333, as we took a look at before. And then it's important to ensure that you're always doing your reconnaissance thoroughly before progressing. Knowing all open services, which can all be points of exploitation, is very important. Don't forget the ports on a higher range that might be open, so always scan ports after 1,000. So beyond the first 1,000 or top 1,000 ports, even if you leave scanning in the background. This is a point, again, that I made, I want to say, in the video for Blue, that you always want to be doing reconnaissance in the background, because you can find an initial vector, and in this case, our initial vector might have been the VSFTP if we didn't scan our top ports here, or a higher number of ports, rather, to take a look at, and then we could have come back later to see that there was more reconnaissance that we had done and found this web server, which is what we're actually going to be taking a look at for this specific room. So always important to be running the reconnaissance in the background. Now let's go ahead and jump into task 3, which is locating directories with GoBuster. So here we're going to be taking a look at a tool called GoBuster. This is a tool for rapidly enumerating directories on a web server. This will allow us to go through and find hidden directories that might not have been secured correctly, or maybe a hidden directory that will otherwise allow us to get some insight into the web server. And we're back. Okay, pause the recording there for a moment because a train was going by, and I don't think any of us really want to hear that in the background. So, as I was saying, GoBuster is a tool for finding directories on a website that might not have been properly secured. This is pretty common, especially if you are taking a look at an internal website. So say you're on an internal pen test and you performed reconnaissance on a network, and you maybe found what appears to be your management network, or maybe a dev section of the network, and you found a web server that you want to go and see if it's going to give you its lunch money. And GoBuster is going to allow you to do that pretty easily. Now, GoBuster is not installed by default on Kali, so you have to go through and perform the installation process here, which will direct you towards GoBuster's GitHub repository. What is installed by default is dirb and dirbuster, and then you can also install my personal favorite, which is dirsearch. However, for the purpose of this video today, we're going to go ahead and use GoBuster. So, taking a look down here, this is some of the common switches within GoBuster. This is going to do some very interesting stuff, and one of the more interesting flags here is -U and -P. It's going to allow you to provide username and password for basic authentication. However, we're going to do a basic set of enumeration using the command that we can see here. So let's flip over to that tab. And here we can see that I've run GoBuster with the command GoBuster dir-u. So this is the URL that you're attacking. In this case, this is the IP of the box that I'm taking a look at, which we'll take a look at what that web page here is here in a moment, and then the word list that I'm going to be using. So this is a very common word list to use. This is actually installed by default on Kali Linux at the time of recording. So it's in USR share word list dirbuster directory list 2.3 small.txt. Very, very good one for doing CTF searches. So before we take a look at the results from that, let's go ahead and take a look at that web page. So on this web page, we can see that looks like we're looking at a Vuln University, and this is just a school's website, which is interesting in and of itself. Typically what we would go ahead and do is perform what's called happy path enumeration, which is actually going through and browsing the website like a normal user, just to see what happens. And a lot of times we'll find different places that we might see items of interest in. So for example, we might find an upload form, which we're going to take a look at one here in a moment, or maybe we find a place where we can place or where we can save comments on the website. Now that can be quite interesting because we can get into cross-site scripting attacks, and I mentioned that specifically for the scope of if you're ever doing a professional pen test, because that's something you're going to want to go through and dive into with greater detail. However, in this specific case, performing some enumeration with GoBuster is going to get us a lot more interesting items. So as we can see with GoBuster, if we let it run for a little bit, it's going to come up with some common directories and then a not so common directory. So first, images, CSS, JS, so JavaScript, and fonts. These are all really, really common. You're going to find these on 95% of websites, maybe not the fonts directory, but these ones are fairly standard. And then internal is probably not something you want to have exposed to the internet. That's not so great. So internal, we're going to take a look at. And if we return to task 3, we can see that the question is, what is the directory that has an upload form page, which we're going to take a look at in a moment? It is internal. And if we flip to this, we can see that, oh, well, that's an upload form. That's certainly something. Perfect. Let's go ahead and jump into task 4, which is compromising the actual web server. So in this specific instance, I'm going to show you how we would go about the process with Burp Suite. However, because there are a very finite amount of file extensions, this is actually something that would be faster just to try on your own. All right, now that you've found a form to upload files, we can leverage this to upload and execute our payload that will lead to compromising the web server. So try to upload a few file types to the server. What common extensions seem to be blocked? After we play with this for a little bit, we'll find that PHP is blocked, which is pretty common because if we take a look at Wappleizer, we can see that this is running PHP. Now, typically on a website, you don't want to allow files to be uploaded that are the same type as what are being executed on your website, because if you aren't handling those correctly, they suddenly become executable, and that's a problem because you can have a user upload a file that is running with the same permissions as your web server, which is incredibly dangerous if you're running it, for example, as root and not www data. And they can gain control over your web server, and that's a problem because it's a foothold onto your website. So we can see that PHP is what's running on this website. Now, what the room wants us to do next is actually go through and upload a couple different files, which if we take a look here, I've got a PHP extensions.txt, maybe, that contains a lot of the common PHP and not so common PHP extensions. So what we would go ahead and do is if we open up Burp Suite, we can intercept a request that using Foxy Proxy for an upload request here on the upload form. And then we go in and actually send that to intruder, and it's going to let us go ahead and change the positions here. So we're going to walk through that quickly. We're not actually going to go through and do that because this is an instance where I would find that Burp is actually a little bit too verbose for what we're doing. So if we take a look at Sniper here, it's going to allow us to go through and capture an upload request. So it's a post request like this. So here we can see that we're trying to upload an index.php file. Now, what we can go ahead and do is target this .php extension, and we can try replacing that. So we know that we have a PHP file. The contents of the file aren't going to change no matter what we upload. However, what we can do is see which ones aren't being blocked. So we can see that PHP itself is blocked. We would try everything that's in this file to see if we can get something else to upload. Now, this is actually a really common one for CTFs, but we'll find eventually that phtml uploads and actually is something that is executable on the file server. So now that we know the extension, real quick to backtrack, this is something that because there are only 5 different extensions for PHP that we're going to try, and this is actually something you can find if you're familiar with Sectlist. It'll tell you these extensions as well within one of their actual lists that they provide. Since there's only 5 of them, I recommend just doing this by hand, unless it's a massive pain in the butt to actually go through and do those 5 uploads. In this specific case, it's good practice, but it takes a lot more time than going through and just doing this manually and renaming the file. So now that we know what extension we can use for our payload, we can progress. We are going to use a PHP reverse shell as our payload. A reverse shell works by being called on for the remote host and forcing this host to make a connection with you. So you'll be listening for incoming connections, upload and have your shell executed, which will beacon out for you to control. So what we do with this is a typical process where we upload a payload to the web server, and we will have a netcat listener or another handler that's waiting to receive a connection. And we can see a brief snippet of it down here. And we're actually going to flip over to here. Actually, we'll take a look at this. So in this specific case, we're actually directed to use a very specific PHP reverse shell. So we can find that here. This is something that you can click on raw and then copy paste this or wget this specifically into a file, which we can see here with the PHP reverse shell. So this is our actual reverse shell. Here we can see that there are 2 things that we are directed to change. This is my IP in the TryHackMe network, and then this is actually the port that this shell comes with by default, and we're just going to roll with it. So copy paste that into a file and then edit these 2 things. This is going to match your IP on the TryHackMe network, and then you can just leave the port as is. It doesn't really matter too much. Typically we would change this to maybe 80 or something, so it's a little bit more innocuous for the traffic. Or we would adjust it otherwise, just depending on what ports are allowed outbound. But in this case, we can confirm that this will work on any port for the most part. So next, now that we've prepared this file, we're going to run something like this command, which is a netcat listener. We're not actually going to run it in this specific case because I do have a netcat shell already open to the box, which we can see there's one there and there's one here. Actually, we can just leave that running. And that is going to allow us to go through and catch the results of uploading this payload. So if we go back through and go to our uploads, we can browse to our actual shell here and upload that, and we find that it goes to this uploads directory, which is pretty cool. Now, you never want to have your uploads directory to be listable like this, let alone have it be browsable from the external internet in a easy fashion. Additionally, to avoid this on a defense side, you would actually rename these files as well. The fact that this web server doesn't rename these is a massive, massive problem. And you want to make that random as well, renaming them. So we can see that we found the uploads directory and we've found where that shell has been uploaded. Now, if we middle click on that to open up a new tab, it looks like we've just got our shell. So very, very slick. What user was running the web server? Now, this is not 100% correct because if we type who am I, we can see that we are www data, but we can cd to home and bill, and we can find that we can actually read the user.txt flag there. It's readable to us, so not technically correct, but it works for what we're doing here. So we've gone ahead, we've gained access in the machine. Now we need to figure out if there are vectors that allow us to escalate to have root control of the machine. Now, this next step, I'm going to actually explain a little bit more than what we guide with, or we allow for guidance, rather, for task 5 from the get-go. So let's go ahead and jump into task 5 with that privilege escalation, and we're going to see how we can gain root on this machine. So now that you compromise this machine, we're going to escalate our privileges and become the super user root. So in this specific case, this room provides a little bit of guidance for what you need to be doing. However, we're going to take a look at how that might have actually been called out originally. So this is a script that I want to call some attention to, which is called linpiece. You can also use, I want to say linenum.sh for this as well, but linpiece is much, much newer and much easier to use. This is a set of scripts that make for they make pretty quick work of privilege escalation, which is wonderful. In this specific case, we're going to use linpiece because we're attacking a Linux system. Now, we can see that this is actually the output of having already run linpiece, what I've gone and done to get it on the machine. Now, you can either copy paste it onto the machine if you have a good enough shell, or you can just use wget and serve it out from a Python web server on your actual host machine. And in that specific case, I actually wgetted it from my host machine into the temp directory on here and made it executable. So here we can see this is the output of running linpiece, and this is going to give us anything that might be potentially interesting to actually escalate through the system. Now, there are actually a number of ways that you can get root on this system because this is, one, a little bit dated, and two, there are some outdated binaries on it. However, as we had called out here, we're going to be looking specifically at set UID. Now, one of the nice things that linpiece actually does is if it finds a vector that is pretty much guaranteed to be vulnerable, it's going to highlight it for you and make it very, very obvious. In this specific case, we can see that there's a section called interesting files, and this is the SUID check. So easy privs, exploits, and write permissions. Now, what linpiece has gone ahead and done is actually highlighted in red and yellow the systemctl, because this is something that shouldn't have that set UID binary there, but it's going to allow us to go through and get root permissions by abusing this. So, again, just to reiterate, even though we did provide a little bit of guidance on where to go, this is actually how you would get to finding that set UID binary being the issue with systemctl using a privilege escalation script like this. You can do this manually, however, using a script is a lot easier, and especially if you're newer at this, is going to make life a lot simpler when you're going through and actually trying to figure out, okay, what do I do now? So with this, we can see that the systemctl binary is an issue. So how do we exploit that? Interestingly enough, we can actually do that with a site called GTFObins, which we're going to go back to the actual main site here, is a curated list of Unix binaries, as we're reading at the top, that can be exploited by an attacker to bypass local security restrictions. So essentially, if you find anything that has these specific attributes, so for example, if you can use sudo with it without a password, or if you know the password, can run sudo with it, you can abuse these to get root permissions or get a root shell. In this specific case, we want to look for anything with the set UID binary. And if we scroll down, we're going to find that there's one here for systemctl. Now, if we click on that, it's going to take us to this page, and we can see that there are two specific ways you can abuse this binary, depending on what permissions are applied to it. Now, since we have the set UID part of it available for us, we're going to use this first step. So, first, we're going to go ahead, and this is actually something that we can see just to call out an excellent write-up on this. If I jump up to the top, that known, if I'm butchering his name, did a wonderful job of explaining. And this is something that I recommend taking a look at if you want to have a little bit more of an in-depth understanding of specifically what we're abusing here. However, what we're actually going to do is create a service that systemctl is going to start for us, and that service is running with elevated permissions. So let's go ahead, we'll switch to number 6 here. We can actually see this is how I transferred the file over with this Python M simple HTTP server. That's just a Python 2 web server that allows us to actually go through and pull that script off the machine. So here we're actually going to go ahead and create the service. You can follow these instructions to copy everything into this variable that we're creating, and this is actually going to run that service with the escalated permissions of root, and then it's going to perform whatever we have here. So in this specific case, we are just going through and actually reading the root.txt file out of the root directory, which is called out here as the last flag. And then we're spitting that out into a readable location with world readable attributes. So we're running this to spit it out into the temp directory. And in this specific case, we can see that we've done exactly that, where we've changed to the temp directory because we can actually write there. So it's a system, or it's a part of the file system where we can actually make files. And then we've gone ahead and created our one-shot service here by just echoing these into the actual service file. Now, last but not least, you'll link that to the systemctl, and then you enable that service so that it causes systemctl to actually run the service now. Now, after that, we can actually check the contents of the temp directory, and we can see that we have the output file as we were looking for before, and we can actually read that, and boom, there's our last flag. So very, very cool box. Demonstrates a lot of interesting parts of performing exploitation and then subsequently getting root access on the machine. So if you're looking for further activities after this, I highly recommend taking a look at some of our other challenge rooms. There are a number of Linux rooms, I believe Lazy Admin might be similar to this as well, that provide similar experiences to actually going through and compromising a web server and then getting root access out of it. But otherwise, that is going to about do it for now. If you have any further questions, hop in the Discord. We're always happy to help. And as always, happy hacking.